Okay, so let's go ahead and start off by stubbing out our YouTube player. So I'm going to come up here to Players, but I'm going to right-click, create a new folder, and I'm going to create a Players folder underneath the Player folder. And inside of the Players folder, I'm going to go ahead and right-click and create a new file called YouTube. And the YouTube player, we're just going to make this real simple really quickly. I'm going to come up here, I'm going to copy over this guy, and we're gonna have to do 3 / slashes because we're in another component or another folder here, and we're gonna import div component from our lib component, and I'm gonna export class YouTube player extends div component. And he's gonna have a handful of properties. He's gonna have a current time, which is gonna return 0. These are gonna be properties that are gonna be on every single player. We're going to have a constructor, which is just going to call super div, which is the default, but I like being explicit, I suppose. Then we're going to have an onAttach, and the onAttach is going to say this element dot add class player YouTube. Then we're going to have an init method, and the init method is going to return an observable. So let's go ahead and import observable at the top. Import observable from RxJS. And we're going to return a new observable of observer goes into. And for now, we're just going to say observer.complete. But in the future, we're going to have an asynchronous operation here. And then we're going to have a play source method. And for this, we're simply going to say console log playing source title. Then we're going to have a stop, which will be console log, or how about YouTube playing blah. And the stop will be simply YouTube stopping. And then we're also going to say this element.hide. And then I guess we can fill in this element.show on play. And also on init, we can put in this element.hide. So we're defaulting to hide. And then we'll have a stop, and then we'll have a seek. And the seek will take in a time, and we'll simply say console log YouTube seeking to time. And this is basically going to be the API for every single player that you might want to implement. SoundCloud or Vimeo or whatever video service you want, even like things like a static image, for example. Like there's nothing stopping you for creating a custom player that shows a gallery of images or something like that. With that done, let's jump back into player.js, and let's first of all go ahead and import our YouTube player. So down here, I'm going to say import YouTube player from players YouTube. Now, I'm going to work from top to bottom here. So the constructor for the player is going to need a playlist store. And he's simply going to say this playlist equals playlist store. And then what I'm going to do is before I forget, when we instantiate the player, remember this is a root component, so all of our hot reloading is happening inside of this file. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, I'm going to import my services. So to import my services, it's going to be similar to what we did with the playlist, where we just imported all the services, or we could import just the playlist store if we want. So playlist store, whatever you want to do there. And whoops, there we go. And for this, we'll come down here to the bottom and we'll pass that into the player component constructor. Now let's go ahead and write our onAttach. So our onAttach, we will grab our title out and we won't set it to anything yet. We'll do that in a second here. Then what we're going to do is say this underscore players equals object. And the object is going to have a YouTube object of new YouTube players. So this is where you would map the source types to an individual player. And then I'm going to create another wrapper node inside of this. I'm going to say const players equals, well, this already is an element component. I'm not going to worry about that, actually. Instead, I think I'm going to, at the top here, say this element add class players, because we already have a div element. We don't need another wrapper. And then what I'm going to do is say const init equals this, or I'm going to import underscore from Lodash. And then I'm going to say init equals underscore map this players, player goes into player init money. And then I'm going to say observable which we need to reference a reactive extension. So import observable from RxJS. We have quite a few imports going on here so far. I'm going to say observable.merge ... list .toArray.subscribe, and then I'm going to say something like this players attached. Or sorry, init list. Let's call this init list. That's a better name. So we'll say init list equals that. So we're getting an array of observables. We're merging them all together. We're using the .toArray so that we're waiting for all of them to finish. And then we're subscribing to that, which this should actually be comp subscribe, passing in this as the first argument. And then once that's done, we invoke our players attached. Of course, I don't prefer this. I prefer writing the code like that, where we bind ourselves to that. And then the last thing I want to do is say this playlist.comp subscribe, passing in, or whoops, this playlist.server time comp subscribe this, and then we'll get the server time is going to pass in the state as an object, and so we'll extract the state. At least I believe it is. Of course, because we use object deconstruction, we have to wrap that in parentheses. But before I forget, let's make sure that I'm correct on that assumption. No, it's going to pass in the current. So the current is going to have a source. And then I'm going to say, if not source, return. Otherwise, I'm going to say title, text, source, title. And maybe we can format this just a little bit better here and do that. There we go. So we're going to update the title as the source changes. So let's go ahead and make sure that that code works first. So let's come back here and refresh. And we get an error. Super expression must be either null or a function, not undefined. Well, that's a really interesting error. I'm not entirely sure what it's talking about. On YouTube. Okay, it's having a problem with our YouTube thing here. Constructor. I misspelled constructor, didn't I? Extends div component. Div component, lib component, constructor, super div. Am I blind? Oh, that's because it's not a div component, it's an element component. That's a very bizarre error, I gotta say. I'm not very happy about that error. That really confused me. All right, cannot read property bind of undefined, and that's because I never made the players attached method. So let's go ahead and do that as well. With that all in place, we should be able to come back here, and indeed, we see the current playing item up there. So if I come here and put on some cache, we get that. If I put on some ELO, we get that. So that's really cool. So we know that's working now. But let's go ahead and write the code that's actually going to tell the players to either show or hide or enable or disable, and also tell the players how to synchronize themselves. So I'm going to come down here to players attached, and let's see here. I'm going to say let last source equals null, and I'm going to say this playlist dot server time dot comp subscribe this, and this is going to take in a source and a time. Then I'm going to say if not source, so if source is null, then we want to say if last source, and if we have a last source, I think actually I'm going to keep track of last source and last player and set them both to null. And then if we had a last source, set last player and tell them to stop, and then set last player equals last source equals null, and then return. So if we stopped playing something, then go ahead and stop it and reset our stuff. Then I'm going to say if source does not equal last source, then we have some stuff to do. So then I'm going to say const player equals this players at source type. And I'm going to say if player does not equal last player, or how about if last player and player does not equal last player, then we need to stop the last player. So last player dot stop, and then we need to set last source to equal source and last player to equal this player's source type, or last player equals player. And then we need our player to actually be enabled, which we don't have to worry about. We can just say player.play source. So far, really straightforward. If we got null in, that means we got to check to see if we have if we had something playing already, and if we did, stop it. Otherwise, set this stuff to null, which we can do actually inside of that if statement, can't we? And then just return, because we have nothing to do at this point. And then if we have a new source, find the player. If we have a player that's different from the last player, stop that old player, and then otherwise start everything back up and tell our new player to play. Then I'm going to say if, let's see, if math.absolute_value of time minus our player dot, actually, I'm going to take this player out and I'm going to move him up here. Player.current_time, which I believe it's current time that I used. Was it? Yep, it was. I was right. If math_adds_time minus current time is greater than 2, then player.seek to time. So if we're off sync by over 2 seconds, then go ahead and tell the player to catch up. And that's it. That's really all of our players attached. So I'll scroll through this code. Pretty straightforward. We have a ton of imports. And then we have our constructor, which just adds the player's class. We grab our title, we instantiate our players, we initialize our players asynchronously. And then we update our title whenever the source changes. Then on players attached, once all the players are initialized, we go ahead and we subscribe to server time and we figure everything out. We I just went over this method. We figure everything out. We make sure that the last player is cleaned up if it's a new player that we need, and we tell the new player to play the new item if that's needed, and then we make sure to synchronize the time if that's needed. Actually, I think a better way to do this would be to say player play source time, and then say else if here. So we're going to tell the player when to start, and then we're going to but then if we still had the same player, the same source, then we'll do the synchronization. And I think that should work out pretty well. So let's go ahead and come back to Chrome, and let's just watch the console. So if we refresh, we should get YouTube playing Electric Light Orchestra, seeking to 250. Now we're going to get a seek every single time because we're currently returning 0 on get current time, but we see now that it's working, and that's awesome. So I think in the next video, we're actually going to import or use the YouTube iFrame API, which is really, really simple to use. So we'll see you guys then.